Usually it's just here, the first semester, to do a course on some aspect of the Torah, the Bible, biblical studies. In the past, we've covered tremendous amounts of stories in the Torah, very powerful messages that were associated with those stories. Today we're going to talk about something that sounds pretty boring, but really very exciting. It's about the journeys of the Jewish people as they left Egypt from the Exodus until they reached the Promised Land. And of course, we know why they had to take all these journeys the last 40 years, because Moses did not have a GPS. So if someone would kindly donate a GPS to Moses, and he won't have to go through this. But also, they say that Moses was definitely a man who would never ask for directions. And that's why they wandered for 40 years. The 42 journeys actually contain about 70% of the entire 5 books of Moses. If you start with the Exodus, which is in the beginning of the book of Exodus, through the end of Deuteronomy, that's about 70% of the 5 books of Moses, is all about these 42 journeys. However, they're summed up in one section of the Torah. At the end of the book of Numbers, you have the listing of all the 42 journeys. You didn't need that to know that there were 42 journeys. All you have to do is read through the entire book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers in your spare time, and then you would count every time they moved from one place to another. But here the Torah does us a service and simply lists all the 42, one after the other. And the name of that Torah portion in which the 42 journeys are mentioned is Maseh. Maseh literally means journeys. Journeys. So this is a class about journeys. Journeys from where? From Egypt. Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is a Hebrew word that has another meaning. It means constraints. And that the way the Exodus from Egypt is explained in mostly Hasidic literature is that every one of us has to experience their own personal exodus from whatever constraints they are in or that is imposed upon them. You could be someone literally living in a place where they are deprived of freedom, the former Soviet Union, for example. When those Jews spoke about the Exodus, to them it was not just a historical narrative, but it was about their own lack of freedom. Or for someone who is incarcerated, they really appreciate what Exodus means because it's a personal thing. But it's a mistake to think that it only applies to people who lived in the former Soviet Union or to a prisoner. We are all, in one way or another, bound by certain limiting influences that are imposed upon us by the outside, or sometimes they are self-imposed. Sometimes we allow ourselves to be imprisoned. Then we have to get out of that. And the end result is we come to the Promised Land. The Promised Land is a metaphor for the ideal situation where we are able to experience the greatest degree of harmony between our own body and soul, between the various parts of our soul, between one another. That is the Promised Land ideal. And of course, as Jews, not only Jews, but especially as Jews, we believe that history will experience the ultimate coming to the Promised Land, both literally and figuratively, with the Messianic age. But throughout our lives, we are going through this journey that takes us from one constraint into a more liberated place. And the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, who's quoted here in this booklet, we're not going to go through the whole quote, it's quite extensive, but the Baal Shem Tov taught us that every one of us, from the time we are born and we leave the womb, we are experiencing the process of the Exodus. from Mitzrayim, from these constraints. And if we go through all of these different 42 journeys, we will be able to identify those stages in our lives that parallel those physical journeys of the children of Israel in the desert. I just want to mention in passing that if you read most English translations of the Bible, they will translate the word midbar as wilderness. And as a child, my teachers always translated it as desert. Why the change? Why from wilderness to desert? And I think, and I'd like to do some more research about this, but desert implies that it's totally barren, desolate, lifeless. And how could an entire nation travel 40 years in a desert? That's exactly the point. That is the point. But the translator is trying to make it a little bit more palatable. It's like the kid who comes home from Hebrew school and tells his mother about how the Israelites had a few F-16s and they bombed the bridges to the Red Sea, and that's how the Jews crossed and the Egyptians drowned. And his mother said, could that possibly be true? He said, well, if I told you the real story, you would never believe it. It's hard to believe that a nation could wander through the desert for 40 years, but that's exactly how that area is described in Deuteronomy. A land, no water, land of no growth, snakes and scorpions, and miraculously, God provided the Jewish people with their ability to exist. So I will not use the word wilderness, I will use the word desert, because that is the truth. And again, I don't know, maybe wilderness is just a more fancy way of saying desert, but I have a feeling that it was there to somehow make it sound not as drastic and as radical as it really was. At any rate, when we travel through our own lives, experiences, we will be able to identify these different journeys. And we're going to go from the first journey in our lives until the final journey in our lives. And we're going to do this in 6 weeks. There are 42 journeys. They correspond to the 42 words in the V'ahavta. You shall love your God with all your heart, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And that paragraph has 42 words that are said to correspond to these 42 journeys. It's the journey of the soul. And there's a lot of discussion about how these 42 journeys parallel the 49 days that the Jews took to go from Egypt till they got the Torah at Mount Sinai. We're not going to get into why here it's 42 and there it's 49. We're missing 7. That is maybe at the end of our discussion. We'll go back to that and discuss it. Some of these journeys are very pleasant. Some of them are challenging. Some of them were setbacks, and where we made terrible mistakes, we made the wrong choices. And that's really what life is. So it's much more real to life when we see how there were these periods of regression, but ultimately we make it to our destination. And this is the challenge for us to identify these junctures in our own lives. A lot of what we're going to be discussing today is based on an essay written by a Hasidic scholar in New York, Rabbi Simon Jacobson. He's the head of the Meaningful Life Center. You try to Google him, you'll find his website. He's a brilliant scholar, and he has an essay where he goes through these 42 journeys. So I'm basing what I'm saying today and in subsequent weeks on his, although I modified it, I think changed a lot of things and added to it, and in some places disagreed with some of the things that he said. But I have to give credit to him because he is the one who establishes this whole system of 42 journeys in terms of our own lives. The Baal Shem Tov, what's the website? Meaningful Life. I don't know the exact, meaningfullife.com or something like that. But if you Google Meaningful Life, it's Simon Jacobson. He also happens to be my wife's first cousin once removed. Okay, let's go to the journeys. Today we're going to try to cover the first 7. If we succeed, fine. If not, we'll continue next week. And guaranteed, at the end of the 6 weeks, we'll go through all 42. Bli neder, without a vow, God willing. Text number 2 on page 4 starts off describing the journeys of the children of Israel who left the land of Egypt. In verse 1, and then in verse 2 it says Moses recorded their starting points for their journeys. And then in verse 3 it finally tells you they journeyed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day following the Passover sacrifice. So they left Ramses. And then in verse 5, after it talks about how Egypt suffered the plague of the firstborn, it says again, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses and camped in Sukkos. Okay. If you count the number of journeys as commentators counted, there are 41, not 42. If you start counting from Ramses, which is in Egypt, obviously Ramses is the name of several of the pharaohs. And that was a city in Egypt. If you count the total number of journeys from Ramses to Sukkos, and Sukkos to Esan, and you go from one place to the other, you will find 41. One of the commentators, lived about 250 years ago, Maskil David is the name of his commentary, explains that the first journey was actually to gather all the Jews who were scattered throughout Egypt to Ramses. Ramses was the place where they all met, from which point they left Egypt. But there was an initial journey to get to Ramses. That is not mentioned explicitly, but that's implied here, and that's the first journey. That is the way some commentaries understand how we get to the number 42. 42 is a Talmudic number that's mentioned in relation to the journeys, and the rabbis knew how to count, even without using their fingers and their toes. So it's obvious that they were referring to this as the first journey. And that's significant over here, because the Baal Shem Tov explains that the Exodus, and it's not his original idea, it's taken from the biblical book of Ezekiel, that the Exodus is the birth of the Jewish people. So going out of Egypt is the birth. Well, when did they leave Egypt? When they left Ramses. So what happened in the first journey? The first journey is what happens before birth. Conception, gestation, pregnancy. The only problem with that, and I'm adding that part, is that their entire experience in Egypt was called pregnancy. They were in the womb of Egypt. It says God takes a nation from within another nation. That the Jews were swallowed up within Egypt. They were in the womb of Egypt. And the Exodus is the birth. So what is this interim period? This is a very interesting point over here. Initially, when they were in Egypt, they were in the womb of Egypt. When they were gathered to Ramses, they were taken from the womb of Egypt. This is a pretty sophisticated medical procedure. The obstetricians here will maybe identify that this might have been done, to take a fetus from one womb and transplant it in another womb, even after the fetus is fully developed. Have you ever seen that happen?
Yeah, it's done.
It's done. Well, this is
So
the
it's not
present.
in a different room, it's taken out, put it back in the same room.
But by the same token, it could be put in some other womb.
So it's a little wiggle room.
Well, that's exactly what happened here. God performed this very interesting surgical procedure to transfer the Jewish people from one womb into another. From the womb of Egypt, where they were enslaved, into a womb where they were nurtured. This is the process of pregnancy, literally, when a person is in his mother's womb. Now, it's very interesting. There's a story in the Torah that Pharaoh calls the midwives, and he says to them, I want you to kill the babies. According to one of the Talmudic commentaries known as the Maharsha, who lived about 450 years ago, Pharaoh could have done it himself. He could have sent some Egyptian soldiers and had them kill the babies. But he didn't want to do that. And we won't go into the reasons why he didn't want to do that. Instead, he called the Jewish midwives to perform abortions on the babies. And that's why by performing the abortion, they would be able to say, oh, unfortunately, the baby died in childbirth. They wouldn't be blamed. Pharaoh had to think, if a Jewish midwife is going to kill all the babies, who's going to ever invite a Jewish midwife to their home? The answer is they're not going to kill the babies. They're going to perform an abortion, and they will say, well, it's too late. We tried to save the baby, and the baby died. So they were going to do something to kill the babies. But this is just a metaphor for the whole process of what Pharaoh was out to do. He wanted to abort the Jewish people. The Jewish people were developing as a nation within another nation, and Pharaoh could not tolerate that. So it's not enough that he wanted to enslave the people. He wanted to make sure that there would never be a birth of a Jewish people. He was out to perform an abortion of the Jewish nation. So what does God do? The first thing that God does is to transfer the Jewish nation, yet unborn, into a different womb in the city of Ramses. What goes on in the womb? The womb is a paradoxical state of affairs for the child. And as we're going to see, many of these wombs are paradoxical ones. What is the paradox of the womb? On one hand, the womb is the most protected place to be. You know, the obstetricians here help explain to us how well the baby is protected by the mother. It's a very nurturing place. It eats whatever the mother eats. It is totally dependent on the mother, completely surrounded. But even on a spiritual realm, the Talmud tells us that before the baby is born, it's taught the entire Torah. And later on, when it's born, it forgets everything. But then it's taught the entire Torah. It has every bit of knowledge. It is an angel that teaches it. It's in touch with God. It's the most spiritually positive environment. Moreover, it says in the Talmud that the soul of the fetus, and the fetus is given an oath to be righteous. What does that mean? Does it raise its right hand or its left hand? What kind of oath could a fetus be given? Well, the word oath in Hebrew etymologically relates to another word that means to satiate it, to satisfy it, to give it energy, to enable the fetus to be able to cope with all the difficulties of life. So that fetus is being energized, is being fed spiritually, and given all the opportunities and all the potential to grow up to be a decent person, a decent human being, a decent, righteous Jew. That is what happened in Ramses. The Jewish people were going through this period of gestation, taken from the womb of Egypt, where they had the opposite of all these other protective things and positive influences. Now they were given all these positive influences, but there's also a drawback to the fetus. Throughout history, we know of so many cases of miscarriage. We know of so many cases of stillborns. It's a very vulnerable state to be in a state of pregnancy. So on one hand, it's the most ideal state. You're in paradise. Why would a child want to be born? One of the reasons it says that the child cries, of course there's a biological reason, but everything biologically parallels a spiritual reason. It's because who would want to leave paradise? Who would want to leave being in the womb of one's mother when you have everything taken care of for you, physically and spiritually? So you have to be forced into birth against your own will. So on one hand, it's a beautiful experience. On the other hand, it's scary, it's precarious, you're vulnerable at that time. The word Ramses. What's the significance of Ramses? The Torah in Genesis says it's the best of the land. It's the best of the land. It was Goshen. Goshen was a part of Egypt. It's the Nile Delta, I believe. The most fertile part of Egypt, the ideal part of Egypt. According to some opinions, it's part of Israel. According to some opinions, when Abraham's wife was abducted by Pharaoh, and then he discovered that she was married to Abraham, he gave Abraham gifts. And according to one rabbinic tradition, one of those gifts was the land of Goshen, the land that the Jews occupied when they were slaves. So Cairo is really part of Israel. We thought we were making claims about the West Bank and Gaza. No, we have much more bold claims. We even have part of Egypt. At any rate, that's the most fertile land. The word Goshen in the Torah, when the Jews go there, it says Goshna, to Goshen. That word Goshna numerically adds up to the word Mashiach. On the dreidel, we have those 4 letters, Nun, Gimel, Shin, Hey. It adds up to Mashiach. The whole drama of Hanukkah, the whole drama of Jewish history leads to ultimately the Messianic age. So here in Ramses, they have Mashiach. They have everything. It's great. They're in their mother's womb. Why would they want to leave that state? But Ramses also has another meaning. It says in the Midrash and Talmud that when Jews built Ramses, as soon as they built it, it collapsed. It was built on swamp areas deliberately. It was designed by the Egyptian oppressors to take away any sense of satisfaction that you have, even as a slave, by building something that would endure. Imagine if you could say, even though you're a prisoner, I built this beautiful structure. But they made sure that every structure they built would collapse, so that Jews would never even get the satisfaction of having built something of enduring value. That is Ramses. So Ramses is the choice place in the world. It's also the most vulnerable place. That's what the state of pregnancy is all about. When you're a fetus, you really have no identity of your own. You are totally dependent on someone else. Even though it's the ideal situation, it's also the least ideal situation to be in because you have no identity. You're in paradise, but you're all alone. Remember Adam? No, you don't remember. You're not that old. But Adam was created where? In paradise. He should have been thrilled. Instead, God says, it's not good for man to be alone. And he creates Eve. Now, if the Torah would have said that God created Eve, we understand why. You need to have people. You need to have Adam and Eve. But it doesn't say that. It doesn't say, I'm going to create Eve so that we should be able to have human beings. There should be procreation. It says, it's not good for man to be alone. You mean even in paradise it's not good to be alone? Yes. Even in paradise, a human being cannot be alone. Alone means that you have no identity, that you can accomplish anything. Alone means that you are locked up in paradise, but it's not worthy of living, no matter how good things seem to be. And this is not just true about a fetus. This is true about every person in their journeys of life could find themselves in places where they're lonely, where they don't have a relationship. Even though they have a good job, everything seems to be going well for them. Life is devoid of meaning because they're alone. We don't measure life just by all of the gifts that we have. We measure life by our ability to make a difference, to have an independent identity where you can do something. You're not just channeling something through someone else and just being a subordinate part of someone and something else. So that's what happened when the Jews were in Ramses. This is the most ideal place in the world to be, and it was also the least ideal place in the world to be, simultaneously. Being in the being in the womb of their mother. Being in God's womb. It's interesting, is the translation of the Torah in Aramaic, known as Onkelos. There's another translation called Yonasan. Yonason was one of the students of Hillel, although many people claim it wasn't not his translation, it's just attributed to him. But it's of a Talmudic period, and it's more of a midrashic translation. It's not just word-for-word translation. And he says something very interesting, fascinating. He said, when the Jews were in Egypt, they had to bring the Paschal offering. God transported them to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, where they performed the ritual of the offering, and he brought them back to be in Egypt the night of the Exodus. So that trip to Ramses was actually a journey to Israel and back to Ramses. What is that trying to tell us? That point was the ideal. You were in Jerusalem. Even though they were in Egypt, they were really spiritually in Jerusalem. And yet they're still in Egypt. They still had not been liberated from Egypt. It was still not the Exodus. A person could think they're in paradise and still be in Egypt. Why? Because as long as your capabilities are still in the potential state and you can't actualize them, you are in Mitzrayim. You are within constraints. One of the reasons the Rebbe spoke many times about how prison is not the ideal form of punishment, and that's why it's not even mentioned in the Torah as an alternative form of punishment. We're not saying we should open the prisons and let all the criminals go, but society has to find much more beneficial ways of punishing and rehabilitating criminals other than prison, except in cases where they're incorrigible and they're a threat to society. Because what is wrong about a prison, even if you give them everything that they want, give them color TV, which they have in some places, you give them every amenity, which they don't give, but even if you could, the fact that you are incapable of expressing yourself, you are in a womb, you are in Mitzrayim, you are confined, and you can't express your human potential. How do you expect a person who needs to be rehabilitated when they can't even express their full human potential? And we're living in a society that has strange priorities. I mean, corporal punishment is called cruel and unusual. Putting someone in prison for 20 years is not considered cruel and unusual. Now, I'm not saying that there are no crimes that deserve that, but it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make any sense. But anyhow, the parallel to that is we could be in our own prisons. We could have great achievements, but if we can't really get out of our constraints to make a difference, we're all by ourselves, we are still in Egypt. But if that's the first step, where we get our empowerment, it's a good thing. It's the first step. And that's what happened to the Jews. They came to Ramses with this energized, spiritual energy, giving them the potential to go and to progress further. And then they go from Ramses to Sukkot. If Ramses is the state of gestation, where the soul is invigorated, Sukkot is the actual birth. Now we're born. We're independent now. We're out of our mother's womb. Here's another paradox. The little baby, and for several years after, is totally independent of the mother, but totally dependent at the same time. Yes, the baby is physically detached from the mother. It no longer thrives on what the mother eats and drinks, but still very much attached to the mother. It depends on the mother for its survival. Here's we have Sukkot. What is a sukkah? A sukkah is another paradox. A sukkah is supposed to be our home. For 7 days, we dwell in the sukkah. Ideally, we're supposed to eat, drink, and even sleep in the sukkah. We live there. It becomes our home. It's our shelter. God protects us. So we are in God's protective cover, and yet the sukkah is a very frail, very vulnerable structure, especially in Buffalo, especially when we had the October surprise. which they had in New York City this year. So it taught them not to make fun of Buffalo. But a sukkah is both shelter, a symbol of protection, of security. That's what parents give their children. If anything, the most a parent can give a child, perhaps, is a sense of security, a sense of knowing that they are protected. They don't have to worry. They don't have to have all the fears. That's why one of the worst things you can do to a child is to violate the child and thereby take away the child's innocence and sense of security, which is so much in the news these days, terrible tragedies that occur where children are not allowed to be children anymore. That's a terrible crime against them. The child has to know that he has a sukkah, a protective sukkah. You're still vulnerable. You're still not, totally protected. You're not in your mother's womb, but you nevertheless have that security. The sukkahs that we originally had were the clouds of glory that protected us in the desert, made sure that we couldn't be attacked by our enemies. The clouds of glory protected us from the elements. It leveled the mountains, so we wouldn't have to climb. It's like a loving parent taking care of the child. But yet the child has a certain amount of independence. Even as a little baby, the child has its own will, and it's not just completely enveloped by the parent. What about an adult? What does that mean for us? When you're in your mother's womb, that's where God totally envelops you and doesn't expect you to do anything. You're not expected. There's a period in our lives when we're in gestation, a student who's learning, who's preparing for a future life. But once we're out in this world, we have to have this paradoxical sense that God protects us. The faith that God will take care of our needs gives us the confidence, gives us the self-esteem that we need. The self-esteem, and this is another subject, is a big mistake. Our society is putting too much of a focus on self-esteem when there's no reason to have self-esteem. How are you going to give someone false self-esteem? But there is a reason to have self-esteem because it's not self-esteem, it's God-esteem. We know that we are God's children. We know that we have God's protection. We know that we have security. That gives us esteem. We know that we count, that we rate. When a child says, I'm a failure, I'm a nobody, or an adult who says that, it's because they're denying the godly part of their personality. So let's not talk about self-esteem. Let's talk about God-esteem. You have to know that you're in God's hands and God protects you and God takes care of everything. But you can't just say, I don't have to do anything. You're no longer in your mother's womb. God takes care of you, but you have to journey yourself. You have to take your own steps. Yes, you fall and you take your first steps, but you must take those steps. God wants our actions, even as He puts us within His protective aura that gives us the confidence to be able to go. So the first stage is where we're totally enveloped. We have no way of relating to the outside. We're lonely, even as we're absorbing so much potential. The second stage is where we're beginning to go out of the cocoon, even though we're still under the protection of our parents. In the case of a little child, in the case of an adult, we have God who's taking care of us, even as we take our first steps. Journey 3, we go from Sukkos to Esau, at the edge of the desert. By the way, I should mention, these 42 journeys parallel the divine emotional attributes. The first attribute, if you look in the booklet, you have chesed shebechesed, kindness within kindness. Kindness within kindness. What does kindness within kindness mean? See the heart over there? Page 6. Kindness within kindness means pure, unmitigated love, where God showers his love in a completely loving environment. That's where you're in your mother's womb. There is no separation. You're just completely connected. So there's love and you're being nurtured. Nurturing is love and the environment is love. There's no separation whatsoever. God forbid if there's separation, we have a problem. In the second journey, it's gevura shebechesed. It's judgment within kindness. Judgment is the act of separation. What is judgment? Judgment is where you stop unconditional, unlimited giving, and you start to say, 1 second, you have to give me an accounting, you have to deserve it. So there's a certain separation of the two entities, one that is giving the other. But it's still within chesed, it's still within kindness. The parents are still overwhelming the child with their love and with their care, even as the child is no longer attached to them physically and emotionally becoming more and more detached. So that's gevura. Gevura is a power of separation, but it's still within chesed, it's still within the overarching love and kindness and nurturing.
The gevura is also setting limits for the child.
Yes? At this point, you never heard a mother, you never heard of disciplining a fetus. There's no way you can do that. She has to discipline herself, but not the fetus. But once the baby is born, that's a very good point, the mother has to set limits for the child. The child can't just get everything he or she wants. Now we have the third journey, which is tiferes shebechesed, beauty within kindness, or harmony within kindness. And I'll explain that after we go through the whole point of it here. What this level is, we go out of Sukkos, and we go to Esam, which is at the edge of the desert, not wilderness, the desert. What is the desert? The desert is life, frightening, with all the challenges, with all the fears. So from the state of a child still being completely dependent on the mother, even though it's separated from the mother, the child begins to develop character. Here it's a blend of dependence and independence. In step 2, there's independence and dependence, but they're not synthesized. The chesed, the kindness, comes from the parents. The separation is the child. Also, the child runs away from the parents and comes back. So it alternates between chesed and gevura. It's not a synthesis. If I'm a person who is loving 1 minute, an hour later I'm very rigid and disciplining, I wouldn't call that tiferes, a blend, a harmony. I would call that I have chesed and I have gevura. And I alternate in one and the other. Tiferes is where there's a harmonization of these two elements. That's a more sophisticated relationship. And our relationship with our child becomes more sophisticated as the child begins to mature. This third level is where the child develops character, and there's a certain blending of their own initiatives with their parents. A simple example is the parent does homework with the child. You know, there's a certain amount of help the parent is giving the child, but giving the child's ability to be able to perform his or her own work. If the parent does the homework for the child, that's not the ideal, although we all do that sometimes. If the child doesn't want to get help from the parent, and the child therefore gets a low grade, that's not good either. And I'm using that metaphorically. There's a certain blending of the two characters of the parents and the child. So there's a certain amount of independence and dependence working together hand in hand. They're not contradictory. In the second stage, there's a contradiction. There's the love, and then there's the separation. and they alternate. Here there's a certain synthesis and a certain blend. And this is the preparation to get into the desert. We're not ready to get into the desert yet. We're at the desert's edge, and we're becoming acquainted with the alien and insensitive world. Eitam has the same letters as the word emet, emes, which means truth. Because Tiferes, beauty and harmony, is the ultimate true emotion. What do I mean by true emotion? Is kindness false? No, kindness ends where Gevurah begins. The minute I'm kind, I'm handing things out to people, and someone else comes along and asks for me, and I said, "You're not getting." My kindness ended, and my strictness, my rigidity, my judgment began. And then after a while, after I'm being nasty to someone, I finally become kind and positive. That's when my kindness begins. So it's not called truth. Truth in absolute terms means something that doesn't have an end. It's not countered by anything else. Well, Tiferes, the third attribute, is the ultimate synthesis and blend of kindness and judgment, where the two work together in harmony. So kindness is not contradicted by Gevurah, Chesed is not contradicted by Gevurah, kindness by judgment, and judgment is not contradicted by kindness. They're working together in harmony. It's like two people are playing instruments at the same time, but they're not synthesizing their sound they're playing. It's a cacophony. It sounds horrible. Or if you hear one instrument playing, then another instrument playing, it might be nice, but it's not really a perfect symphony. A perfect symphony is when they're all playing together in concert. That's what makes it beautiful. The same thing is true with art. The same thing is true with everything in life. When the two attributes at that stage in life, there's a certain synthesis. If we can do that in our own lives, to synthesize the kindness and the gevurah, the judgment, not alternate from one to the other, we have it made to a certain extent. And it's also interesting that the word eitam has the word tam, which means whole, complete. Who is referred to as the complete one of the patriarchs? Jacob. Ish tam, Yaakov ish tam. He's a complete person. And Yaakov is also associated with the attribute of Tiferes, of beauty. This is the most beautiful period, you could say. When do you really love your children the most? When they start to develop character and they're cute and you have a certain relationship, you can talk to them. When the baby is 2 months old, we're not going to say you don't love the baby and your feelings aren't there. But when is there a real beautiful relationship? It's when they're growing up, before they become teenagers. That's when they're perfect.
I thought it is when they support themselves.
That's the second. Now we get to, Eitam to Pi HaChiros. Pi HaChiros means, the word chiros is related to the word cherut, which means freedom. Facing Baal Zephon, the lord of the north, that was an idol, camping near Migdal, the tower. Oh, now we're getting into the teenage years. And remember, everything that we describe here in the development of the child is true about us at different times in our lives. And sometimes in the same day, we can have all of these 42 journeys. Or in the same week, the same month, the same year. Because everything in life that goes through the development from birth till the end of life is something that we experience in different ways throughout our lives. Here's where we have Netzach Shebechesed. Netzach means victory, perseverance, or stubbornness, steadfastness, tenacity, chutzpah. These are all valid ways of describing Netzach. Victory, when a person has to show that they are right and they're going to win no matter what, and it's their way, there's no other way, That is what we mean when we describe the independence of a adolescent. True, it's still chesed. They still need their parents' support. Even in America, until you're 18, you're still owned by your parents, and you depend on them in many different ways. And even in Jewish tradition, even though bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah means that you're an adult, but parents are still responsible for you. If not legally, then it's certainly functionally they're responsible. They're still usually paying for your education. They're paying for your for almost everything. They're not totally independent, but they are netzach. They are full of anger, rebelliousness. They think they're smarter than their parents and want nothing to do with them except when they need money. And that's what piachiros means. They are free. They think they're free. They're independent, but they're also standing in front of Baal Tzifon, the Lord of the North. That was an idol. They lose their childhood innocence, and they begin to take on paradoxical features. On one hand, they're free, independent. They can make rational decisions. They're not driven by childhood emotions. They can have sober reflection. They're normal adults, you would think. On the other hand, the newfound freedom also puts them in the position where they are standing in front of the idol of the North. They begin to be tempted to worship false gods, whether it's self-glorification, worship of money, power, or the other man-made deities. What does that have to do with the North? In Jewish literature, the North is simultaneously the symbol of wealth, material wealth. It says that in the temple, the menorah, which symbolizes wisdom, was in the south. The table, which symbolizes wealth, is in the north. And if you want wealth, when you pray, you should direct yourself towards the north. If you want wisdom, direct yourself towards the south. That's what the Talmud says. What does that mean? It means that the north is associated with wealth. And the north is also, the word tzafon in Hebrew, which means north, also means hidden, insidious. There are certain insidious gods, deities, or insidious forces that become manifest with a teenager. How many parents have looked at their sweet, innocent, wonderful, cute, perfect children and then discover the monsters that they become? Where did they get that from? Where did it come from? Obviously, it was within them. Those were hidden parts of their personality. Not every teenager is that way, and this is not autobiographical. But we all know that teenage years can be very, very difficult years for the parents, as well as for the teenagers. Certain hidden aspects of their personality begin to manifest themselves that you can't, they're unrecognizable. And their temptation for these things, the worst things that corrupt society, the wealth, the power, and other things, become so pronounced. Their subconscious comes out, that the negative subconscious. So this Eitam, this innocent child, this perfect child, Eitam meaning whole and beautiful, and emes and real, and you see, when you look at a child, you see God. Every child is referred to as my anointed one, my Mashiach. And all of a sudden, when they turn after their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, they become something unrecognizable. They're no longer seen, they're scary teenagers. It's interesting, one of the commentaries known as the Baal HaTurim notes that there's a use of the singular in this verse. Singular use of the word pi hachiros. Why is it used in the singular? So he explains that in the face of freedom, there's a certain unity. And I think in this context, what is the most powerful pressure known to humanity? Peer pressure. Peer pressure has wreaked more havoc on the world than any other pressure. You have to conform. Isn't it interesting? this rebellious teenager who only knows how to separate from his parents and deny everything that his parents has given him and really become this rebellious child, all of a sudden begins to feel that they have to conform to what their friends do. They're so embarrassed with their parents because of their friends. Their friends' parents are great, but their own parents. Isn't it strange that each teenager thinks that his friends' parents are perfect? If only you could be like my friend's parents, everything would be great. That's normal. Don't think it's abnormal. Don't get upset if that happens. That's normal. So where does this unity come from? And the answer is Migdal, the tower. You know the first tower that was built, God demolished because it was a tower of unity, but it was the wrong type of unity. It was unity for self-aggrandizing unity. It's to become big and famous and powerful, and then in order to achieve that, you need to have this certain type of unity. That's not the good unity. There's another unity called Migdal. It's used in the grace after meals. A quote from the book of Samuel, Migdal Yeshua Smalko, which is the tower associated with the Messianic age. That's the tower of virtue. Unity is great, but if it's the wrong type of unity, the unity that is associated with this sense of freedom, and I can do whatever I want, and I don't care what you say, I have no respect for authority, the rebellious type of freedom, excuse me, that type of freedom which generates unity is a Tower of Babel. That will collapse. That will not endure. That will not last. And of course, as adults, we also have our rebellious periods. We also know of how in the Haggadah we say the 4 sons, and there's the wicked son, the wise son. They're not 4 sons. They're all the same son. Who has 4 phases. Same child can go through all 4 phases. We all have our rebellious streak. Not necessarily all the time, but there's a time in our lives when we feel like breaking away. And in order to do that, we try to find people who want to join us in breaking away. One of the things I found very disturbing and cute at the same time is that when I came to UB in 1972, and this is still the 60s environment, we found how students were rebelling against the establishment and non-conforming, and they all non-conformed in the exact same way. The exact same ripped jeans, the same drugs, the same living in communes, doing the exact same thing. Everyone is conforming in their rebellion against the establishment. So that's exactly what happens here. The singular use over here is to indicate that these teenage years is netzach, is victory, is stubbornness, is rebellion, and it's what generates and brings about peer pressure that goes along with that. And that's a very dangerous period, but we have to know that it exists, and we have to know how to deal with it. And even then, it's chesed. The parents still have to have that chesed, that kindness. They still have to feel that they are their parents, and they are loving. They love that child no less, even though the child is giving them so much grief. Yes?
Doesn't this model indicate that this rebellion, even though it looks not so nice, a necessary part of the journey? I mean, what does it say about the child who never rebels, is always a good boy or a good girl? Is something missing in the journey?
I don't like to say that if a parent tells me, you know, my teenagers were always wonderful, they never rebelled against
We
me,
don't believe it.
that I should tell them, you know what, something is wrong with you. No, I say, thank God, we're very, very fortunate. I don't know if we have to believe that there has to be rebellion in every situation, number one. Number two, you don't even know, just because the child is so well behaved, you don't know.
You were already a rebel yourself, Father.
Right now, he wants us to argue, debate, protest, and ask him to change things. And we do not lack faith when we do that. But in the end, we of course know that there's a plan and God is just, and we, how can we question God who is beyond anything that we can possibly fathom? Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment on Harvey's question, is that if Abraham, I won't use the word argue, but argued with God, if you will, on Sodom and Gomorrah, certainly Moshe argued with God, because when he said he's gonna destroy them, Moses really argued with God and said, if you do this, help me out. Don't, so he really argued.
But he's not the only one. I mean, Abraham, Moses, and throughout Jewish history, the greatest people of faith argued with God.
Even the word Israel means struggle, which is different than Islam, which means to surrender. We don't surrender. We keep questioning it.
Well, we have both. I mean, there's a tendency to discover what others say, and we say we don't accept what they say. No, surrender is part of Judaism as well. There's both. We have surrender. There are times for us to surrender and accept God's judgment, and there's sometimes when we have to argue with God. Judaism is not just one stance. It's multi-level. Just like over here, we have faith, we have emotion, we have action, and the interplay between all those three. Yes?
Rabbi, we talked about faith and all the tenets of the Judaism. And as you were talking, I'm thinking to myself, but doesn't that apply, all these tenets apply to Christianity, Catholicism? I mean, they also preach faith and do good and all that. What is the difference? I mean, I know that's a long...
Okay. I will tell you all my extensive knowledge of other religions. I could give you about a 30-second lecture. I'm not qualified to talk about other religions. All I can say is that we were here first. Talking about getting credit, if they have similar ideals, they got it from us. But the little knowledge I do have of other religions is they do not put the same emphasis on action that Judaism does. They put a lot more emphasis on faith relative to action, although they do put a lot of emphasis on action. They do a lot of good things, and look at all the Catholic hospitals and Catholic charities and things like that. And so does every religion, even the least popular religion these days can take a lot of credit for a lot of good that they do. No one is putting down anyone else's good behavior. Here we're trying to focus, what does Judaism teach us, not what are they doing wrong. We're talking about what we're doing right, or what we believe in. And we believe, and I think we are probably the pioneers in this regard, that action is the most important thing, but we have to fuse that action with feeling, and it should be based on the foundation of faith. And we do not look down at someone who temporarily is in only one of those areas. If someone tells me I have so much love for my fellow, says, did you ever go out and help anyone? I can't get out of the house, but I really love my fellow. So there are two ways I could react to that person. You're a hypocrite. You're full of hot air. You don't really mean anything. Or I could say, you know what? That's beautiful. That's wonderful that you have those feelings. Now act on them. So there are two ways you could look at that. And we're not here to knock a person who does one of those three. We're here just to demonstrate that you need all three. But if you have a choice, the action is the most important thing. You wake up in the morning and you don't feel like doing anything. You don't have the faith, you don't have the feeling. Go out and do a mitzvah. Forget about your feelings and your faith. Just do it. The feelings will come later. The faith will come later. Guaranteed. Yes, one more question. I will take a little break.
Rabbi, the 613 mitzvahs are quite specific. Does it cover everything in a changing world? In a changing world. Does it cover?
Can you give me an example where it wouldn't?
I don't know. If you go to the moon, for instance, in the future, will it cover something like that?
Absolutely. There's been much discussion on this. Tragically, the Israeli astronaut perished. But when he went up to space, he consulted with rabbis about certain aspects of Jewish law. When do you keep the Sabbath? Every 90 minutes, you're orbiting here. Do you keep the Sabbath every 7 periods of 90 minutes? Or do you have to keep the Sabbath? There's no Sabbath, perhaps on the moon. If you're tired of keeping Sabbath, you just take a trip to the moon. Let's get out of it. These are discussions that are going on, have been going on for the last 20, 30 years. as to what Jewish law, by looking at certain precedents, we have certain precedents because there are certain parts of the earth that don't have normal astronomical cycles. What do you do if you live in the North Pole or the Arctic Circle? So these are discussed extensively in Jewish law based on precedents, based on getting to the core of what these laws are about and applying them to these new situations. So when we get to the moon, we're going to have rabbinic counseling as to what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to live our lives. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Next class. So if a person says, I want to make a lot of money so I could give charity and I could support needy causes and needy people and I can do good for this world, that's a very healthy, that's a very positive. What did the Jews do with the money they got from Egypt? They built the Mishkan, they built the tabernacle. That's a positive thing. The problem is that when you focus on things like that, you forget about why you want to make the money and what the real reason is, and you become obsessed with the money. It drags you down and begins to erode your value system. So that's what was going on over there. They were hoarding the money in order to do good, but they got carried away. They forgot why they're hoarding the money. That's what happens in life very often. We start to do a good thing, and we forget why we're there, and we begin to glorify the process as opposed to using it as a means to an end. I've heard people say, I love making money. What do you mean you love making money? Why do you love making money? If they would say, so I can give my money to worthy causes, I would say, fine, that's not so bad. I hope you do other things in life, you love other things besides the money. But when a person says, I love money because I just love making money, then they've lost their whole sense of direction. And this is what happens when a child becomes an adult and begins to start making money, and they go to college and they get a skill and they start thinking about how much money they're going to be making. They mess up their whole system. You know what? One way of determining whether your pursuit of wealth, of material gain, is a kosher one, is to see if it is parallel to the same degree of excitement about spiritual goals as well. You know, in Hebrew, the letter Hey is a very important letter. Letter Hey has a line on the right, a line on the top. If I had a third hand, I would put the line over here. And those represent three areas of life. The right represents the thought processes, the spiritual. The left represents the physical, the material. And the top one represents speech, or the mechanism to take from the thought process to translate into action, into material. That's the letter Hey. It's one of the letters of God's name. What happens if you take the left line and you extend it downward? What do you get? What letter do you get? A kuf. What does kuf mean in Hebrew? Kuf. Just change the vowel slightly. Kuf is a ape, a monkey. It mimics human behavior, but it's not human. When a person has the left, the pursuit of wealth, of material gain, if it parallels the right, the pursuit of spiritual ideals, and they go hand in hand, parallel lines, you are a Hey. You are a godly person. That is perfect harmony. And there's nothing wrong, because your left is not inconsistent with your right. But if you let your left go further, if your zeal for material gain is greater than your zeal for spiritual ideals, then you schlep, again to use that English word, yourself downward. And whose name begins with a kuf that we know of is infamous? Korach. Korach was known to be the wealthiest Jew of his time. He allowed his wealth to go too far, thinking that that gave him the power, the prestige to be able to assert himself as Moses' rival. You have to have that balance. And that's the time of your life, crucial time of your life to maintain that balance. Because what happens, as long as you're a child and you're even a teenager, you're totally dependent on your parents for your sustenance. You don't have that same, you're not tempted. You didn't taste the taste of independent making of money. But as soon as you become somewhat independent and you have the skill, you're already thinking of the millions and the billions that you're going to be making, and that could corrupt you. So it may be a healthy thing, getting the wealth of the Red Sea, but it can turn into something disastrous at the end. And what happens? They come to Marah. Marah means bitter. That's where they had bitter waters. They couldn't drink. And this is a stage of life when you begin to also encounter disappointment. You thought life was going to be so perfect and so ideal, and all of a sudden your plans don't materialize. You don't get the job you thought you were going to get. You don't get the raise you thought you were going to get. You don't get the opportunities that you thought were all open for you. Things do not work out the way, and things become very bitter. And this is a stage that you have two choices in response to. You could either complain, as the Jews did, of course, in the desert, or they could rise to the occasion and sweeten the waters, as Moses did. God says to Moses that if the Jews follow my commandments, then they will no longer have to have this bitterness. We could sweeten the bitterness if we have the right ideals. And the word ho, it also comes from the word modeh, which is to be grateful. This stage in life, the child begins to be grateful to the parents for all of that they've given the child. And that's the state of being grateful for all the things that we have. We could kvetch about things in life. Kvetch is another English word that means complain. We could complain about things we don't have. Perfectly all right, as long as you also show gratitude for the things you do have. This is what I call parallelism. You want wealth? Fine, but have the same desire for spiritual wealth as you have for material wealth. You want to complain about the negative things in life? Not the greatest thing, but show an equal amount of gratitude for the positive. If you do one more than the other, the negative more than the positive, then you've distorted your whole life. And that's important to know, especially at this stage in life. Then they left Marah and they came to Elima. In Elima, Elim, there were 12 water springs and 70 palms. This is the level of Yesod, Shebachesed. Yesod is translated as bonding. This is where the child begins to become even more independent. He begins to bond with others, culminating with marriage, of course, which is the ultimate bond. But who gives you over in marriage? The parents. So you're still under the wings of your parents. It's still chesed. It's still the kindness of your parents. You're still in that first stage in life when you're under the wings of someone else. But it is now your turn to bond with someone. And that is where you have 70 palms. 70 is considered to be the number of the word sod, which is secret. And also yayin, wine, which is 70. This is where the wine of your neshama, your soul, begins to express itself. The hidden love, the power of love that materializes with marriage is a very powerful part of your soul that a child doesn't have. The child has love for his parents, but this new type of love and this bonding is developed at this stage where you are now ready to go to the next level. And the final journey, left Elim and camped near the Red Sea. They go back to the Red Sea. This is where you begin to see the results of your parents' kindness. This is where you start a new life. The tranquility of the sea is something that you enjoy. You have your own house, a career, the birth of a child, the grandchild of the parents. This is Malchus. Malchus is the last level. It's where things begin to materialize. All of what the parents started off with, and they started from the time of your being formed, the time of conception, now it's really taken root. When the parent sees the child starting his or her own home, her own life, especially when there's a grandchild, which are, of course, always perfect. They never go through these different stages. It's interesting how the same person can go through different stages. When they're a child, but when they're grandchildren, they're perfect every inch of the way. That validates the very first, that shows that the Exodus was a true Exodus. At the beginning, the first process was validated. That all the energy that you got at the time that you were born is now bearing fruit. This is, you're back in the sea, a resort area. Now you don't have to worry about anything else. Everything is fine. No danger, no attendant danger. You have the rejuvenating power of the water, and everything seems to be fine. And if you could stop at this point, we wouldn't have to go any further. But unfortunately, life doesn't stop at this point. So that will continue next week, I believe.